Hello friends and welcome back to our YouTube channel. Since our exam has been cancelled, let's take this positively and use the extra time to prepare thoroughly for the upcoming examination. This is a great opportunity to aim for higher marks or achieve JRF. So let's start studying. Today we'll cover important critiques in literary criticism and their significant works. We'll start with the Greek critics. First Greek critic is Socrates. Socrates, a foundational figure in Western philosophy, is renowned for his method of dialectical questioning, which laid the groundwork for critical thinking and ethical inquiry. His approach, known as the Socratic method, challenged conventional wisdom and sought to uncover underlying truths through dialogue. Despite leaving no writings, his ideas were immortalized by his students, particularly Plato. Socrates, the father of Western philosophy, is a figure who left no written records of his own. Yet his impact on literary criticism and philosophy is immeasurable. Our next important Greek critic is Plato. Plato, a student of Socrates, was a seminal Greek philosopher who founded the academy in Athens, one of the earliest institutions of higher learning. His works, including the Republic and the Symposium, explore justice, politics and metaphysics profoundly, shaping Western philosophical thought. Plato's dialogue often feature Socratic questioning, blending his mentor's method with his own philosophical insights. Now let's see important work by Plato. First is Republic. Explore justice, the ideal state and the philosopher king, offering profound critique on poetry and its societal role. Next is Ion. Discusses the nature of poetic inspiration and the relationship between poets and their craft. Next is Symposium, a dialogue on the nature of love, blending philosophy with the literary beauty. Next important work is Phaedrus. Examine rhetoric, love and the soul, highlighting the power of a persuasive speech. Next is Apology, Plato's account of Socrates' defense at his trial, showcasing his mentor's commitment to truth and virtue. Next is Crito, focuses on justice, duty and the individual's relationship to society. Next important work is Phaedo. Details the last moments of Socrates, discussing the immortality of the soul. Friends, Plato, the towering figure of ancient philosophy, wove intricate dialogues and transcend time, blending deep philosophical inquiry with the literary artistry. His works challenges us to think critically about justice, love and the nature of reality. Next important critic is Aristotle. Aristotle, a student of Plato, made significant contribution across numerous fields including philosophy, science and politics. His works such as Nicomachean, Ethics and Politics emphasizes empirical observation and the study of the natural world. Aristotle's influence extended through the development of logic, metaphysics and ethics, shaping Western intellectual tradition. Now let's see his important works. His first important work is Poetics, analyze the principle of literary theory, focusing on tragedy. Key concepts include catharsis, hamartia, that is tragic flow, and anagnosis, that is recognition. Next is rhetoric. Explore the art of persuasion, examining the role of ethos. Ethos means character, pathos means emotion, and logos means logic in effective communication. Next important work is Poetics. Investigates the organization and function of the state, touching upon ethics and the role of citizens in governance. Next important work is Nicomachean Ethics. Discuss the nature of virtue and the path to the good life, emphasizing practical wisdom and moral character. Next work is Metaphysics. Explore the fundamental nature of reality, addressing questions of existing substance and causality. Now let's discuss about Roman critics. Our first Roman critic is Horace. Horace, a prominent Roman poet and critic, is best known for his works Odes and Ars Poetica, which offer insights into poetic craftsmanship and literary criticism. His writing emphasizes the importance of artistry, balance, and the moral purpose of literature. Horace's influence on Western literature endures, particularly through his advocacy for the principle of decorum and the integration of wit with wisdom. Now let's see important works by Horace. His first important work is Ars Poetica, the art of poetry, a verse epistle that provides practical advice to poets on the craft of writing, emphasizing unity, decorum, and the blend of instruction and pleasure. Next important work is Odes, a collection of lyric poetry that explore themes of love, friendship, politics, and the simple pleasure of life, showcasing Horace's mastery of poetic form and style. Next important work is Satires, a series of poems that offers a witty and critical examination of Roman society, human behavior, and personal ethics, blending humor with a moral insight. Next important work is Epistles, a collection of letters in a verse form that reflects on various aspects of life, literature, and philosophy, often addressing personal and societal concerns with wisdom and grace. Next is Epodes, poems that mix political commentary with a personal reflection, marked by their use of the iambic meter and sharp, sometimes biting tone. Our next Roman critic is Longinus. Longinus, traditionally attributed as the author of On the Sublime, is a critical figure in Roman literary criticism. His treatise explored the concept of the sublime, emphasizing the power of a great writing to evoke profound emotional response and elevate the human spirit. In short, On the Sublime, a profound treatise exploring the nature and effects of sublime literature. Longinus identifies 5 sources of sublimity: great thoughts, strong emotion, certain figures of a thought and speech, noble diction, and dignified word arrangement. The work emphasizes the emotional impact and grandeur that elevate literature beyond the ordinary. Next is Quintilian. Quintilian, a distinguished Roman rhetorician, is renowned for his comprehensive work Institutio Oratorio, which outlines principles of effective rhetoric and education. He emphasized the moral and ethical responsibilities of the orator, advocating for the development of well-rounded virtuous speaker. Institutio Oratorio, Quintilian's comprehensive guide to rhetoric, emphasizes the moral, character, and ethical dimensions of oratory. Now let's discuss about Middle Age critic. Philip Sidney. Philip Sidney, an English Renaissance poet and critic, is celebrated for his influential work and apology for poetry. In this treatise, he defends the value of poetry against its detractors, arguing that it educates and inspires virtue through imaginative engagement. Sidney's eloquent advocacy significantly shaped English literary theory and the role of poetry in society. Now let's see his important works in detail. First is an apology for poetry, a passionate defense of poetry as a noble and powerful art form, asserting its ability to inspire, instruct, and delight. Sidney argues that poetry, far from being frivolous, serves a moral and educational purpose, enriching the soul and fostering virtue. Next important work is the defense of poesy. Similar to an apology for poetry, this work reaffirms Sidney's belief in the moral and educational value of poetry. He condemns that poetry, through its imaginative power and emotional resonance, offers deeper truth about life and humanity than other forms of literature. His next important work is Astrophil and Stella, a sequence of sonnets exploring themes of all love, desire, and the nature of poetic inspiration. These sonnets are considered some of Sidney's finest poetic achievements, blending personal emotion with the literary craftsmanship. His next important work is Arcadia, a prose romance that weaves together themes of love, chivalry, and pastoral idealism. While not strictly a work of literary criticism, Arcadia reflects Sidney's literary taste and ideals, showcasing his belief in the power of literature to create idealized worlds and inspire moral virtue. Now let's see about Enlightenment Age Critics. And first is John Dryden. John Dryden, a prominent English poet, playwright, and critic of the Enlightenment, is noted for his critical essays, such as an essay of a dramatic poesy. He championed the principles of clarity, order, and decorum in literature, shaping neoclassical standards. Dryden's influence extended to shaping the form and function of English literary criticism, establishing foundational norms for evaluating literature. Now let's see his important works. First is Essay of Dramatic Poesy, 1668. This essay is a seminal work of literary criticism, where Dryden discusses the merits of classical versus modern drama through a dialogue among 4 characters, each representing different critical viewpoint. Next is Of Heroic Plays, an essay, 1672. In this essay, Dryden defends the concept and structure of heroic plays, emphasizing their moral and aesthetic values, and respond to contemporary critics' criticism of the genre. Next is Preface to Annus Mirabilis, 1667. In this preface, Dryden explained his approach to writing the poem Annus Mirabilis, detailing his use of quatrains and discussing the significance of the events of 1666, such as the Great Fire of London. Next is Preface to All for Love, 1678. Dryden uses this preface to justify his adaptation of Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, arguing for the importance of a dramatic unity and the adaptation of classical stories and contemporary audiences. Next is Preface to Troilus and Cressida, 1679. Here Dryden discusses his reason for revising Shakespeare's play, emphasizing the necessity of refining and clarifying the original to suit modern tastes and expectations. Next is Preface to Fables, Ancient and Modern, 1700. In this preface, Dryden outlines his translation approach for the collection of fables, providing insight into his views on translation, adaptation, and the timelessness of classical literature. Next is the dedication to the rival ladies, 1664. This dedication includes Dryden's reflection on the nature of a love and honor, themes central to the play, and showcases his early critical thoughts on dramatic construction. Next is Preface to Albion and Alabinus, 1685. Dryden uses this preface to defend his opera Albion and Alabinus, explaining his choice of the operatic form and addressing criticism regarding its political and allegorical content. Next is a discourse concerning the original and progress of satire, 1693. This work is an in-depth examination of the origin and evolution of a satire, where Dryden compares Roman satirists like Juvenal and Horace and discusses the function of satire in society. Next is a parallel of poetry and painting, 1695. In this treatise, Dryden draws parallel between the arts of poetry and painting, exploring their similarity in terms of creativity, expression, and impact on the audience. Next is dedication to the Aeneas, 1697. In this dedication, Dryden discusses his translation of Virgil's Aeneid, elaborating on his translation philosophy and the challenges of rendering the Latin epic into English verse. Our next critic is Alexander Pope. Alexander Pope, a leading literary figure of the Enlightenment age, made significant contributions to literary criticism through his poetry, essays, and prefaces. And here is a list of his major critical works. First is an essay of criticism. An essay on criticism, 1709. This seminal work is a poetic essay that outlines Pope's views on literary criticism, emphasizing the importance of taste, judgment, and adherence to classical principles. Next is Preface to the Works of Shakespeare, 1725. In this preface, Pope provides his insights on Shakespeare's genius and addresses the editorial challenges he faced in preparing the text, marking one of the earliest attempts at Shakespearean scholarship. Next is the Dunciad. This satirical poem criticizes the perceived decline of literary standards and attacks various contemporary writers and critics, reflecting Pope's sharp wit and critical eye. Next is an essay on man, 1733 to 1734. Though primarily philosophical, this poem contains significant critical commentary on the nature of humanity and the role of literature in understanding the human condition. Next is Preface to Iliad of Homer, 1715. Pope discusses his approach to translating Homer's Iliad, detailing his efforts to balance fidelity to the original text with the need for poetic elegance in English. Next is Preface to Odyssey of Homer, 1726. In this preface, Pope elaborates on the challenges of translating the Odyssey, offering insight into his translation methodology and his views on the epic's themes and styles. Alexander Pope, the brilliant wit and incisive critique of the Enlightenment era, whose words cut through the pretentious and follies of the time like a double-edged sword. Our next important critic is Samuel Johnson. Samuel Johnson, the literary giant whose words echo through the corridors of time, stirring hearts and minds with their wisdom and wit. Now let's see his important works in detail. The Rambler, 1750 to 1752, a series of essays published twice a week in which Johnson explored a wide range of topics including morality, literature, society and criticism, providing deep insight into human nature and literary art. Next important work is the Idler, 1758 to 1760. Similar to the Rambler, these essays were published weekly and offered Johnson's reflection on various aspects of contemporary life and literature, characterized by their wit and wisdom. Next is the lives of the most eminent English poets, 1779 to 1781. The biographical and critical work contains detailed lives of 52 poets with Johnson's penetrating analysis and evaluation of their works and contribution to English literature. Next is Preface to Shakespeare, 1765. In this preface, Johnson offers his critical perspectives on Shakespeare's play, addressing their strengths and weaknesses and defending Shakespeare against contemporary criticism while emphasizing his universal appeal and profound understanding of human nature. Next is A Dictionary of the English Language, 1755. Though primarily a lexicographical work, Johnson's dictionary includes numerous critical observations on the usage and meanings of words, as well as illustrative quotations from a wide range of literary sources, reflecting his deep engagement with the English literature. Next is A Journey to the Western Island of Scotland, 1775. While primarily a travel narrative, with the work includes Johnson's critical reflection on the culture, society and literature of Scotland, providing valuable insight into his broader critical perspective. Now let's see the Enlightenment thinkers. Next is Giambattista Vico, an Italian philosopher, historian and jurist, is known for his contribution to the philosophy of history and culture during the Enlightenment, and here is a list of his major critical works. First is On the Study Methods of Our Time, De Nostri Temporis Studiorum Ration, 1709. In this work, Vico critiques the educational methods of his time, particularly the overemphasis on Cartesian rationalism. He advocates for a more balanced approach that includes rhetoric, history, and the arts, emphasizing the importance of imagination and practical wisdom. Next is universal right. This extensive work is divided into two parts. On the one, principles and one, end of universal law. Vico explore the origins and development of a human society, law and institution, emphasizing the role of common sense and historical context in understanding legal principles. Next is the new science. Vico's magnum opus, The New Science, proposes a new philosophy of history. He introduced the concept of a causae et recursi, cycles and recurrences in history, arguing that human societies develop in recurring cycles. The work integrates history, mythology, and philosophy to understand the development of civilization. Next is on the most ancient wisdom of the Italian. In this treatise, Vico challenges the dominant Cartesian philosophy by asserting that the ancient Italian possessed a form of wisdom that combined metaphysics, language, and culture. He argues for the primacy of poetic wisdom and the importance of historical consciousness. Next is autobiography. Vico's autobiography provides insight into his intellectual development, personal struggles, and the evolution of his philosophical ideas. It is a valuable resource for understanding his thoughts and the context in which he worked. Friends, these works collectively showcases Vico's innovative approach to history, philosophy, and culture studies, emphasizing the importance of historical context, common sense, and the cyclical nature of human development. Our next important critic is Edmund Burke. A prominent figure of the Enlightenment, is the best known for his political philosophy and critical writings on society, government, and aesthetics. And here is a list of his major critical works. First is A Vindication of Natural Society, 1756. This satirical work critiqued the idea of natural society by mimicking the style of Lord Bolingbroke, arguing ironically that rejecting the institutions of civilized society would lead to chaos and disorder. It serves as a defense of civil society and established institutions. Next is a philosophical inquiry into the origin of our ideas of the sublime and beautiful, 1757. Burke explores the psychological and aesthetic dimension of the sublime and the beautiful, distinguishing between the two and examining their effects on human emotions. Next is Reflection on the Revolution in France, 1790. This is very important work. Burke's most famous work. It offers a critical analysis of the French Revolution, arguing against its radicism and predicting its descent into chaos and tyranny. He defends the importance of tradition, social continuity, and gradual reform. Next is Thoughts on the Cause of the Present Discontents. In this political pamphlet, Burke addresses the cause of a political unrest in Britain, criticizing the influence of court factions and advocating for greater accountability and public participation in government. Next is an appeal from the new to the old Whigs, 1791. This work defends Burke's his conservative stance and his opposition to the French Revolution against criticism and his former Whig colleagues. Next is Letter on a Regicide Peace, 1796 to 1907, a series of letters in which Edward Burke vehemently opposes making peace and revolutionary France. He critiqued the French revolutionary government and advocate for continued resistance against its spread. Our next important critic is Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine was a pivotal figure in the late 18th century, renowned for his influential writings that significantly impact the American and French revolutions. His work remains a cornerstone of Enlightenment thought, advocating for human rights, liberty, and democratic governance. And here is a list of some of his major critical works. First is Common Sense, 1776. This pamphlet was a pivotal in encouraging American colonists to seek independence from Britain. Paine argues for the creation of a dramatic republic, criticizing monarchy and hereditary succession as unjust and unnatural. Next is The American Crisis, a series of pamphlets written during the American Revolutionary War. These essays were meant to inspire the colonists to continue their fight for independence. The famous opening line, "These are the times that they try men's souls," exemplifies Paine's powerful rhetoric. Next is Rights of a Man. In this work, Paine defends the principles of French Revolution against the critic like Edmund Burke. He argues for natural rights, the legitimacy of revolution against tyrannical governments, and the establishment of democratic governments that protect individual freedoms. Next is The Age of Reason, a critique of organized religion and a defense of deism, which work challenges the legitimacy of the Bible and traditional religious institutions. Paine advocates for rational approach to religion, emphasizing reason and scientific inquiry over blind faith. Next is Agrarian Justice. In this pamphlet, Paine discusses the concept of social justice and economic inequality. He proposes a system of social welfare funded by a tax on landowners to provide citizens with the basic income and support the elderly and disabled. Friend, this work highlights Thomas Paine's contribution to political theory, revolutionary thought, and critique of religion and social inequality, showcasing his enduring influence on Enlightenment ideas and democratic principle. Our next important critic is Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes, an influential Enlightenment thinker, primarily known for his work in political philosophy, also contributed significantly to critical thinking and analysis. And here is a list of his major works with the critical and philosophical content. First is Leviathan. Hobbes' most famous work, Leviathan, is a foundational text in political philosophy, where he discusses the structure of society and legitimate government. He explores human nature, the necessity of social contracts, and the role of a sovereign authority. Next is De Cave, on the citizen. This work precedes Leviathan and presents Hobbes' ideas on political theory, focusing on the relationship between individuals and the state, and the importance of civil peace and social unity. Next is De Corpore, on the body. A philosophical treatise, De Corpore, is part of Hobbes' trilogy on human nature and knowledge. It dwells into metaphysics and logic, laying the groundwork for his later political theories, by examining the nature of physical bodies and human perception. Next is Behemoth. In this posthumously published dialogue, Hobbes analyzed the English Civil War, discussing the causes, events, and the consequences of the conflict. He offers critical insight into human behavior, governance, and the instability of political institutions. Next is a dialogue between a philosopher and a student of the common laws of England. This dialogue explored the relationship between philosophy and law, with the Hobbes critiquing the common law system of England and arguing for the superiority of legal system based on rational principles and sovereign authority. Next is the elements of a law, natural and politics, an early work that outlines Hobbes' theories on human nature, ethics and politics. It is divided into two parts, focusing on the nature of individual and the formation of political communities, providing a precursor to the more developed ideas in Leviathan. Next important critic is John Locke. John Locke, a central figure of the Enlightenment, made significant contribution to philosophy, political theory and education. And here is a list of some of his most important critical works. First is an essay concerning human understanding, 1690. This foundational work in epistemology explores the nature of human knowledge and understanding. Locke argues against innate ideas, proposing instead that all knowledge is derived from sensory experience and reflection. Next is Two Treatises of Government. In this seminal text, in political theory, Locke outlines his theories of natural rights and the social contract. The first treatise critiques the divine right of a king, while the second treatise lays the groundwork for modern democratic governance and the protection of individual rights. Next is a letter concerning toleration. This influential letter advocates for religious tolerance, arguing that civil governments should not have authority over individual religious practices and that religious diversity should be accepted to ensure social peace. Next is some thoughts concerning education. In this work, Locke presents his views on education, emphasizing the development of characters and practical skills over rote learning. He advocates for a child-centered approach and the importance of moral education. Next is the reasonableness of Christianity. Locke examines Christianity from a rational perspective, arguing that the core tenets of the Christian faith are reasonable and accessible to human understanding, promoting a more inclusive and tolerant view of religion. Next is of the conduct of the understanding. This posthumously published essay offers guidance on intellectual self-discipline and critical thinking. Locke discusses how to cultivate a sound understanding and avoid common cognitive errors, stressing the importance of open-mindedness and continuous learning. Now let's see the Romantic Age critic. And first is William Wordsworth. William Wordsworth, a central figure of the Romantic Age in English literature, was not primarily a critic in the traditional sense, but did write several preface and critical essays that reflects his poetic theories and views on literature. And here are some of his major critical works. First is Preface to Lyrical Ballads. Wordsworth and Coleridge's preface challenged the poetic convention of their time, advocating for a poetry that drew inspiration from ordinary life and the natural world. They argued that poetry should evoke emotion recollected in tranquility. Next is preface to poem. In this letter preface, Wordsworth reflects on the evolution of poetic style and philosophy, acknowledging criticism while reaffirming the principle of celerity, simplicity, and the power of imagination in poetry. Next is essay supplementary to the preface. This essay expands on themes from the 1815 preface, discussing the poetic process, the relationship between poetry and the mind, and the moral and spiritual dimension of poetry. Next is preface to the exertion. The preface to the exertion elucidates Wordsworth's poetic vision and the thematic concerns of the poem, particularly the idea of the poetic as a moral guide and the exploration of the human condition through nature and contemplation. Next is a letter to the friend of Robert Burns. This letter demonstrates Wordsworth's appreciation of Burns' poetry and his belief in the power of poetry to capture the essence of a national character and human experience. These critical works and preface illustrate Wordsworth's influential role in the shaping Romantic poetry and his enduring contribution to literary theory, emphasizing the importance of nature, emotion, and the individual imagination in poetry. Next important critic is S.T. Coleridge. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, a prominent figure in the Romantic Age, contributed significantly to poetry, literary criticism, and philosophical discourse. And here is a list of his major critical works. First is Biographia Literaria. This work combines autobiography, literary criticism, and philosophy. Coleridge discusses his own poetic theories, the principles of Romantic poetry, and the views on imagination and symbolism. Next is Lectures on Shakespeare. Coleridge delivered a series of lectures on Shakespeare, which were later compiled and published. These lectures are noted for their insightful interpretation of Shakespeare's plays and their influence on Shakespearean criticism. Next is on the principles of a genial criticism. In this essay, Coleridge explored the principles of literary criticism, advocating for a holistic approach that considers the genius of the author and the emotional response of the reader. Next is Lectures on Literature. These lectures cover a wide range of literary topics, including the nature of poetry, the development of literature, and the characteristic of different literary genres. Next is The Friend. A series of essays published in periodical The Friend contains Coleridge's reflection on literature, philosophy, politics, and society. It includes discussion on aesthetics, ethics, and the role of the critic. Next is John Keats. John Keats, a key figure of the Romantic Age, known primarily for his poetry, did not produce extensive critical writing in the traditional sense. However, his letters and poetic preface offer insight into his poetic theories and reflection on art and literature. Here are some of the notable critical works associated with the John Keats. First is Preface to Endymion. In the Preface to Endymion, Keats defends his imaginative approach to poetry and his belief in the importance of beauty and sensation in art. He responds to critics who found his poetry extravagant or lacking in narrative coherence. Next is Letters. John Keats' letters provide personal insight into his poetic development, his views on the role of the poet, and his engagement with the literary traditions and contemporary trends. They reveal his ideas on the importance of imagination, emotion, and the sense in poetry. Next is the fall of a Hyperion, a dream. Although not completed, the fall of a Hyperion marked a significant departure from Keats' earlier poetic style and thematic concerns. It reflects his experimentation with the poetic form and his exploration of mythology and human aspirations. While John Keats did not produce formal critical essays like some of his contemporaries, his letters and poetic preface provide a profound insight into his poetic theories and reflection on art, beauty, and the human experience. This work continued to contribute to our understanding of Romanticism and its ideals. Next is Victorian Age Critic. And first is George Eliot. George Eliot, the pen name of Mary Ann Evans, was a significant literary figure of the Victorian age, known not only for her novels but also for her critical essays and reviews. And here is a list of some of her major critical works. First is Silly Novels by Lady Novelists. This essay, published in the Westminster's Review under her real name Mary Ann Evans, critiquing the conventional and formulaic nature of novels written by women during her time. It addresses societal expectation and limitation placed on female authors. Next is The Natural History of German Life. Also published in the Westminster's Review, this essay examines German literature and culture, offering insights into its influence on Victorian society and literature. Next is Women in France, Madame de Staël. A review of a French biography of Madame de Staël. This essay reflects Eliot's interest in the women's role and achievements in history and literature. Next is The Influence of Rationalism, an essay exploring the impact of rationalist philosophy on contemporary society, reflecting Eliot's engagement with intellectual and philosophical currents of our time. Our next important critic is Frederick Nietzsche. Frederick Nietzsche, though primarily known as the philosopher, also made significant contribution to literary criticism and cultural analysis during the late Romantic and Victorian periods. And here is a list of some of his major critical works. The Birth and Tragedy. Frederick Nietzsche's exploration of a Greek tragedy as a synthesis of the Apollonian and Dionysian artistic impulses. He argues for the importance of art and affirming life's contradictions and complexities. Next is On Truth and the Lies in the Non-Moral Sense. This essay challenges traditional notions of truth and language, suggesting that human understanding is shaped by metaphors and subjective perspectives rather than objective reality. Next is Untimely Meditations. This series of essays critique contemporary culture and philosophy while advocating for more life-affirming and individualistic approach to intellectual inquiry and historical interpretation. Next is Beyond Good and Evil. Frederick critiquing a traditional morality and his call for a philosophy that transcends conventional dichotomies of good and evil, emphasizing the importance of individual creativity and self-expression. Next is on the genealogy of morality. Frederick's genealogical investigation into the origins and development of moral concepts, challenging the foundation of culture's ethical system and advocating for a re-evaluation of values based on strength and vitality. These critical works by Frederick reflects his profound influence on philosophical thought, culture criticism, and literary theory during the late Romantic and Victorian period. His writings continue to provoke debate and inspire scholars across various disciplines. Next is G.M. Hopkins, Gerard Manley Hopkins. Though primarily known as a poet, also produced critical works and essays that reflect his thoughts on poetry, literature, and the theology during the Victorian age. And here are some of his major critical works. First is On the Origin of Beauty, a Platonic dialogue, Hopkins' undergraduate thesis at Oxford, where he explores Platonic philosophy and its implications for aesthetics, particularly the nature of beauty. Next is Letters and Correspondence. Hopkins wrote numerous letters to friends, family, and fellow poets, where he discusses his poetic theories, religious beliefs, and critique of contemporary literature. These letters provide insight into his thoughts on poetry and artistic expression. Next is Henry James. Next critic is Henry James, a prominent figure of the late Victorian and early modernist periods. Was primarily known as a novelist and short story writer. While he did not produce formal critical works in the traditional sense, he did write numerous prefaces, essays, and literary reviews that offer critical insight into literature and art. And here are some of his major critical works and contributions. First is The Art of Fiction. In this essay, James argues for the artistic autonomy of the novel, advocating for a realism that captures the complexities of a human psychology and society. He discusses the techniques of fiction writing and the moral responsibilities of the novelist. Next is prefaces and introductions. Henry James' prefaces and introductions often reflect on the themes, characters, and the narrative strategies of his own works, offering readers a deeper understanding of his creative process and literary intention. Next is Literary Review and Essays. Henry James' literary reviews and essays engage with a wide range of authors and literary movements, from contemporary realism to the symbolist movement. His critique provide valuable insights into Victorian and early modernist literature. While Henry James is a primary remembered as a novelist, his critical essays and reviews demonstrate his keen intellect and the significant influence on literary criticism during the late Victorian and early modernist period. His writings continue to be studied for their insights into the craft of fiction and the evolution of literary aesthetics. Next is Matthew Arnold. Matthew Arnold, a prominent Victorian poet, critic, and culture commentator, wrote extensively on literature, education, and society during the Victorian age. And here is a list of some of his major critical works. The function of criticism at the present time. Matthew Arnold's essay defines the role of the critic as a mediator between literature and society, and advocating for criticism that promotes intellectual and cultural growth. He argues against mere personal opinion and calls for a higher standard of judgment in evaluating literature. Next is Culture and Anarchy. In this work, Arnold critiques Victorian society's division between the barbarians, means materialistic, and the Philistines, means narrow-minded conformists. He advocates for a sweetness and light derived from culture, which he sees as a remedy for social strife and moral decay. Next is Essays in Criticism. Arnold's essays evaluate the literary merits of various poets and authors, emphasizing the importance of classicism, poetic form, and moral seriousness in literature. He promotes a critical approach that values high standards of literary excellence. Next is on translating Homer. Arnold's essay reflects his deep appreciation of a classical literature and discusses the challenges and principles of translating Homer's epic poetry. He stresses the importance of fidelity to the original text while making it accessible and meaningful to contemporary readers. Next is Literature and Dogma, an essay towards a better appreciation of the Bible. In this essay, Arnold explores the Bibles as literary and moral text, advocating for critical and rational interpretation that transcends doctrinal dogma. He argues for the enduring relevance of religious texts as sources of ethical guidance and cultural influence. Matthew Arnold's critical works and essays played a significant role in shaping Victorian literary criticism and cultural discourse. His ideas on the role of literature, criticism, and culture continue to be studied and debated for their lasting impact on intellectual thought and literary theory. Next is T.S. Eliot, a major literary figure of the 20th century, straddled the boundaries of the Romantic and Victorian eras with his profound influence on modernist poetry and criticism. And here is a list of some of his major critical works. First is Tradition and Individual Talent. In this seminal essay, Eliot argues that great poetry is rooted in the literary tradition that precedes it. He emphasizes the importance of the historical senses and the relationship between the past and the present in creating new work. Next is Hamlet and His Problem. In his essay Hamlet and His Problem, T.S. Eliot argues that Hamlet is an artistic failure due to its lack of objective correlative, which means the external situation doesn't sufficiently represent Hamlet's internal emotions. Eliot contends that Shakespeare was unable to fully translate the source material's complexities into a cohesive play. As a result, Hamlet's emotions appear disproportionate to the events of the play, leading to what Eliot perceives as a disjointed and unsatisfactory narrative. Next is the metaphysical poets. T.S. Eliot's essay, The Metaphysical Poets, praises the 17th century poets for their ability to blend thought and feeling using intricate metaphors and complex imagery. He highlights their intellectual rigor and their capacity to juxtapose the spiritual and the physical. Eliot argues that these poets' innovative use language and form set them apart, offering a more holistic and unified approach to poetry. Next is The Sacred Wood, Essay on Poetry and Criticism, a collection of Eliot's critical essays where he discusses various poets and literary traditions. Key essays include Tradition and Individual Talent, where he proposes the concept of the objective correlative, and Hamlet and His Problems, where he analyzes Shakespeare's play. Next is Selected Essays, another collection of Eliot's essays covering a wide range of literary topics. These essays dwell into the work of Dante, Shakespeare, Milton, and other poets, as well as broader cultural and philosophical issues. Next is The Use of Poetry and the Use of Criticism, a lecture series delivered by Elliot at Harvard University, exploring the nature and purpose of poetry and criticism. He discusses the relationship between art and society, the role of tradition in literature, and the challenges facing modern writers. Next is On Poetry and Poets, posthumously published collection of Eliot's critical essays, including reflection on modern poetry, literary criticism, and his own poetic practices. It includes essays on Baudelaire, Dante, and other poets. Next is the varieties of metaphysical poetry. An essay where Elliot explored the characteristics and themes of metaphysical poetry. Focusing on poets like John Donne, George Herbert, he discusses their use of wit, intellectuality, and complex imagery. Next is Edgar Allan Poe, American critic. Edgar Allan Poe, known primarily as a master of Gothic fiction and poetry, also made significant contribution to literary criticism, particularly through his essay, reviews, and critical theories. And here is a list of some of his major critical works. The Philosophy of Compositions. Edgar Allan Poe provides insights into his methodical approach to writing poetry, emphasizing the importance of planning and calculation in achieving a desired emotional effect. He dispels the notion of a poetic inspiration as spontaneous and instead advocates for deliberate craftsmanship. Next is the poetic principle. In this essay, Poe argues that poetry should aim to evoke a powerful emotional response in the reader, which he considers the essence of its effectiveness. He discusses the characteristic of true poetry and critiques superficial or didactic verse. Next is the rationale of verse. Edgar Allan Poe's exploration of technical elements of verse reflects his belief in the precision and musicality of language in poetry. He analyzed different forms of meter, rhyme, asserting their role in enhancing the aesthetic appeal of poetry. Next is literary review and essays. Edgar Allan Poe's literary reviews and essays offer critical assessments of contemporary authors such as Nathaniel Hawthorne, Charles Dickens, and Washington Irving. He evaluates their works based on criteria of originality, imagination, and literary craftsmanship. Friends, Edgar Allan Poe's critical works are characterized by his emphasis on technique, craftsmanship, and the psychological effect of literature. His theories on composition and poetry continue to influence literary criticism and creative writing, commenting his legacy as a pivotal figure in American literature. His critical ideas are unity of effect, aestheticism, criticism, Gothic and Macbeth, legacy and criticism, harshness, elitism. Friends, these critics and thinkers have provided us with the lenses through which we view literature. Their works challenges us to think deeply, question boldly, and appreciate the profound beauty and complexity of literary art. Thank you for joining me on this literary journey. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and subscribe for more insight into the world of literature. Until next time, keep reading and keep questioning, and let your love for literature guide you. Happy studying, everyone. All the best for your exam, and thank you so much for watching.